Welcome back to Writing the West, where we talk to writers, filmmakers, historians, and storytellers shaping how we understand the American West. I'm your host, Tyler Offhammer with Cowboys and Indians magazine. Today I'm joined by Mark Archuleta, an Emmy winning screenwriter, journalist, and performer. A fifth generation Coloradan, Mark grew up surrounded by stories of the characters who shaped Western history. His work often explored how history gets refracted through the lens of film and television, sometimes in surprising ways. His new book is The Real Thrilling Events of Bank Robber Henry Starr, a biography about a Cherokee outlaw who became one of the most prolific bank robbers of the early 20th century, and then a silent film star trying to rewrite his own story before his final attempted robbery in 1921. Mark, welcome to Writing the West.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
So let's get us started where you started. What first drew you to Henry Starr and his story?
I was a literature major from the University of Colorado in Boulder. Kind of had the idea of writing the great American novel. When I graduated, I moved to Los Angeles to be an actor and screenwriter, and things had changed. Now you wanted to write the great American screenplay. I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was a famous screenplay called The Cheese Stands Alone that Arnold Schwarzenegger had bought, and it was $1 million for the screenplay. So I was an actor and a writer, and so I always kind of had my antenna out for a great story. I was in Burbank. This is like 1990, so ancient history. There was a Crown bookstore, and I found in the bargain bin this book right here, which is Henry Starr's autobiography, The Thrilling Events, Life of Henry Starr by himself. And I said, hey, that kind of looks like me. And so then I started going through his story. And here's a guy that was the greatest bank robber of his era. He was sentenced to hang twice. He had his sentence commuted by President Teddy Roosevelt for bravery.
Wow.
And then I go on to learn more about him that you know, uh, he's the first person to be able to pull off a double daylight bank robbery,
Wow.
which Jesse James and the Dalton gang could never accomplished. And then, as you mentioned, later in life becomes a matinee idol. What a
Wow.
strange story. And I said, well,
Wow.
this is a movie. And so I've been working on trying to get this made into a film for decades, collected lots of information on the film, and I said, well, gosh, if the movie never gets made, all of this research will go to waste. So I decided, oh, you know what? I'm gonna put this book together, pitched it to the University of North Texas Press. They loved the idea, and so now it's available.
Well, we love the book too. And for those that are listening now, the book is available. I believe it came out right at the end of July. And tell us a little bit about the background in research for this book. Henry Starr isn't necessarily a name like Jesse James and Billy the Kid. How'd you go about finding information about Henry Starr? How difficult was it? And was there anything that surprised you in your research?
So most people, when they hear the name Henry Starr, they'll say, "Oh, is he related to Belle Starr?" Belle
Right.
Starr's much more famous, and he was tangentially related to Belle Starr. So Belle Starr's maiden name was Belle Shirley, and she was born in Carthage, Missouri. She loved hanging out with outlaws. She had Cole Younger's love child, um, but one of her husbands was Sam Starr, which was a cousin of Henry Starr. So she became a Starr,
Wow.
in that way, but not a blood relative. She would have died when he was about 16 years old, so he knew her, but no relation. Newspapers always got it wrong. They said that they were a husband and wife, or that was his, he was her son, and well, so we're setting the record straight now. So yeah, I began researching this in 1990. So for the youngsters, that's pre-internet.
Yeah.
And so when you start researching at that time, you actually had to go to the libraries or you look at previous publications. Glenn Shirley, a great Oklahoma historian, had a lot of information, had written books. So then, as years went on, you had more access to the newspaper archives. And so I was able to just find out a lot of more information about him through that. And then there's something called the Pioneer History interviews that was a Works Progress Administration project at the time, where they would go out and interview old timers and
Right.
get their stories of what the Old West was like. And Henry Starr was often referenced in those. So I gleaned a lot of great information from that. The reason that he's not as well known and famous is because he wasn't a bloodthirsty outlaw,
Yeah.
right? Like the James Younger gang, they killed people. Outlaws that came later, Bonnie and Clyde, Dillinger,
Right.
right? They left a bloody wake, and Henry Starr always lived by the motto of not making sure that nobody got killed in the commission of a bank robbery, and nobody ever was.
Wow. Wow. What about his life drew him into a life of crime?
So he was born in 1873 in the Indian Territory, Fort Gibson. His father was Hop Starr. He was half Cherokee, and his mother Mary was quarter Cherokee. His father fell ill when he was about 12 years old, and he had to leave school. His father died shortly after that. What a lot of people don't know about the Old West was that the deputy marshal system, they didn't get a paycheck.
Hmm.
Like it wasn't like every 2 weeks or at the end of the month they got a paycheck. So they, got per diem for delivering writs or warrants or transporting prisoners. So they were incentivized to create work.
Hmm.
And how did you create work? Well, you would arrest people, you would false charges, right?
Wow.
And who they preyed upon was the poor whites and blacks and Indians who had no social status
Right.
or money to defend themselves. And so Henry Starr, without a father, fell victim to corrupt deputy marshal system. He was falsely accused of bringing liquor into the Indian Territory. Even the deputies say, yeah, well, that he probably wasn't guilty of that. But more seriously, he was arrested for horse thievery. And he was only 16 years old, and he's thrown into chains, and he's transported all the way to Fort Smith, Arkansas. He has to sell all of his possessions to hire a lawyer. There was no juvenile system at the time, so he's thrown in with all the hardened criminals. He is attacked by the prison gang, but he's very good with his fists, so he fights them off. But he came out of that. They say they described it as his rollicking boyishness was gone,
Wow.
and they had turned him in the minds of the community into a criminal
Right.
based on false charges. And so he kind of said, well, if I'm going to have the name of being a bad guy, I'm going to be the best bad guy I can be.
Wow. Wow. And not to forget either, Starr was Cherokee,
Yes.
and that obviously influenced public opinion in that time period as well. What did you learn in your research about the dynamics surrounding his Cherokee ancestry?
He talks about in his autobiography about how the West had changed while he was there, and how the white people had come in to the territory, and they took pity on the white people because they
Mhm.
didn't know how to raise crops, and they would allow them to be in the schools for free. Like
Mhm.
he went to Tlaquah seminary. And the Cherokee families had to pay, but they allowed the white children to attend free. And then he talks about how over that time that the white people had become arrogant, and they
Mhm.
started, treating the Indians like they were second class, and so the world kind of had turned upside down. But in
Right.
terms of like how once he became a criminal, you can see it in a lot of the newspaper articles how there was a bit of a race baiting with him. Like they would use terms like savage,
Mm.
or they would say something like he's very dangerous when drunk.
Ah,
Right. And Henry Starr didn't drink. He's abstemious. So they kind of fit him in the cliches. And then in another way too, they said that wherever he left a trail of bodies in his wake. Right. So they
right.
really tried to characterize him as this bloodthirsty, uh, Native American with, slanderous terms.
Right.
Um, a lot of people, now he was a bank robber. It wasn't like, but other bank robbers didn't also have that added
Right.
racist element to it. And
Right.
then, and then maybe if you want to get to this later, but the racism of the time also impacts how when he makes his silent film A Debtor to the Law on how it was made and how it was marketed.
Right, right. Well, and before we get into that, I did want to jump back to Fort Smith when you mentioned that moment where he says, "Well, if I'm going to be labeled a criminal, I might as well act like one." What did that transition look like for him? And what was the first bank robbery, and how did he build that reputation from that point on?
Well, so apparently it was pretty easy to find people at the time that were willing to pull off ice, and so he joined with a couple of fellas and robbed the Nawada Depot. That was one of his first. And then he robbed a bank in Caney, but his big debut, if you want to say, was the June 5th, 1895 bank robbery in Bentonville.
Mm,
And he goes in with a armed gang and they pull off the bank robbery. What's interesting is that he was only 19 years old,
wow.
and he was such a leader. He was so charismatic that he could get older men who were hardened guys. Like I always think of, maybe the cast of the Wild Bunch, you know,
Yeah.
but he was the teenage leader of these guys,
Wow.
and he set the standard of saying, look, nobody gets killed, and so nobody was killed in this bank robbery. They get away with it. And in fact, I was in Bentonville 2 weeks ago uh, uh, for the book signing, but they really love the history.
Yeah.
We did a full blowout on the history, and they used to recreate the bank robbery and stuff
Wow.
like
That's
that.
cool.
Um, and what's interesting too is that at 19, he had his own dime novel series.
Wow.
Only one other outlaw had their own dime novel series, and that was Jesse James. So if at 19
Good
years old,
company.
yeah, yeah, if you're a criminal,
Using good loosely. Right.
yeah. So he was already famous at 19,
Wow.
in the most common sort of entertainment of the day, the people's entertainment of the day, which was dime novels, which is
Right.
interesting because then he becomes the a silent movie star, which is
Right.
sort of the common people's entertainment a
Yeah.
generation later.
Yeah. Well, and to get to that, that's what's so striking to me about Henry Starr is not only is he a bank robber and almost a Robin Hood-esque type bank robber in the way of,
Yeah.
he's got his morals, his scruples that he sticks to. But like you said, became this silent movie star. So how did that transition happen?
Yeah, you talk about a little bit about him being a Robin Hood, and the excuse me, the subtitle of my book is From Gentleman Bandit to Movie Star and Back Again. And, beyond just him not having anybody be killed during his bank robbery, but he did have these Robin Hood qualities. There's a story about how he found a bunch of bank loan notes. Um, and so he takes those so the
Oh.
the people don't have to, or they'll have to figure out who owed what. And he
Wow.
took those and dropped them in a river. There was another case of when one of the men was making a deposit of like $70 or something like that. And then Henry Starr's gang busts in and they take all the money and then they take the hostages out with them, to protect them as they get to their horses as shields. And the guy's complaining. He's like, I didn't get a deposit slip. I didn't get a deposit slip. I'll never get that money back. And so Henry Starr says, okay, look, just reach in the bag, get your $70 already.
Wow.
Um, and then the greatest story of I think is when he was robbing the bank in Stroud, and he's in the middle of the bank robbery, and the screen door slams. Banks had screen doors in that day.
Yeah, go figure.
The screen door slams, and he's got the gun pointed at the bank president, but he turns around and there's nobody there, and he looks down and he sees a 4-year-old little girl.
Wow.
And this little girl, on a Saturday morning, her routine was to go to the bank and the cashier would give her a shiny new penny. And so she was there to get her penny.
He
And he
wasn't
says, look,
leaving without it.
yeah. And she says, look, you got to scram. This really isn't the place. A bank robbery, really isn't the
Yeah.
place for a little girl. But she was determined and she dug her foot in and said that she wasn't leaving. So Henry Starr said, okay, look, I will promise I will buy you an ice cream if you just sit here and be good. And he gives her a lap full of shiny pennies.
Wow.
And so and she does remain good. But what the capper to the story is that 5 years later, he returns to make the motion picture recreating that bank robbery at Stroud. They
Wow.
hire the little girl is too old, so they hire another little actress and they recreate the scene. And the director says, cut. And Henry Starr looks over, and there's the little girl, the real little girl from years ago. And he says, I remember I promised you an ice cream, didn't I? And so he gives her a dollar and she skips off with her friends and
Wow.
goes and buys an ice cream. So
Wow.
that's really what I think is, some of the remarkable stories that are in the
Yeah.
book and what makes him really a special, interesting outlaw.
Yeah. Were a lot of these from newspaper accounts and different methods like that? All these stories?
Newspaper accounts, interviews
Okay.
with people. The little girl as an older woman in her 70s or something like that. She was interviewed again
Wow.
and talk. So yeah, a lot of it was interviews that
Wow.
came later. And
Yeah.
like I said, those Indian pioneer histories
Right.
and
Right.
things like that.
So, how did Henry Starr find his way to silent films after
Well,
skirting the
so
law?
yeah, so I talk about there being 10 star filmmakers
Hmm.
who were U.S. marshals or deputy marshals that went in the transition to becoming movie directors and producers, and there were three outlaws that also became actors. Henry Starr one, and then I also in the book profile Al Jennings and Emmett Dalton, who was
Okay.
the
Yeah.
only surviving member of the Dalton gang,
Right.
and all of those guys become movie stars as well. About an interesting thing that happened was Henry Starr was shot and
Okay.
captured in 1915 when he was
Wow.
trying to rob the Stroud bank robbery. This is the double bank robbery.
Okay.
Almost everyone else got away, but he got captured. And he is recuperating upstairs of a building, and he hears the noise of the crowd down below calling for him to be lynched.
Wow.
And so he sent a telegram to former Deputy Marshal William Tillman, who lived in Chandler, which was about 20 minutes train ride away.
Okay.
And Tillman had been in the process of making a motion picture called The Passing of the Oklahoma Outlaws. We're talking about 1915. And he would always try to cast the people who were surviving. Most
Wow.
outlaws were killed, but
Right.
like he had Catalani and Little Britches, and
Wow.
he had Arkansas Tom from the Ingalls battle. So he comes to Stroud and he makes a deal with Henry Starr and he says, if you let me use my motion picture camera to film you being transported to jail, I will keep the crowd from lynching you.
Wow.
It's very similar to Hollywood Deals today.
I guess so.
And he,
Wow.
so he took that, and so that was the very first time he appeared on film. And of course, I think that probably put a bug in his head. He then ends up going to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary for the next 5 years. By 1919, the motion picture industry has become the fourth largest industry in the United States. It's
Wow.
just boomed, and especially Western. So he gets out in 1919. William S. Hart is the big silent cowboy star of the
Mm,
time. And producers come up to him and they say, you know what? Audiences are kind of tired of these Shakespearean trained actors pretending to be cowboys. They want authenticity.
yeah.
Right. Well, it didn't come more authentic than Henry Starr, right?
Yeah.
So he's in his 40s, 45 years old, comes out, doesn't have a lot of options, and wants to lead an honest life, if we can call motion pictures an honest life. So he's offered to make this motion picture, and so he recreates his life story on
Wow.
film. He goes back to the places that he had originally robbed. He hires the same real people, like the boy Paul Curry, who had shot and captured him at Stroud. He hires him to play
Wow.
himself in the motion picture. So it's and so you had mentioned up at the top that it's kind of like viewing his life through the prism of a motion picture camera. So
Mm.
he recreated his life and wanted to explain what made him an outlaw and also try to dissuade young kids from becoming outlaws because he had a teenage boy named Teddy. And he didn't want him to follow in his footsteps. So he really made this motion picture to try to show people that this life isn't that glamorous.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, and one thing that's so interesting to me is Starr found himself at that really perfect transition time where you had outlaws on horseback who were trying to outrun cars, and trains were all over the place now, and automobiles, and obviously film, and so was that also part of, I wouldn't say a PR move, but like this attempt to reform not only for his son, but for this younger generation? Because, as we saw later on with like Bonnie and Clyde, the law had so many new resources at its disposal. When you had a guy like Starr who outran the law for, I mean, many years at this point, was he kind of sensing a change of the times in a lot of that way?
Well, he was very smart. He began his career robbing banks on horseback.
Yeah.
In 1915, when he's going to do the double bank robbery at Stroud, he had pulled off many, many heists. He used Tulsa as his base of
Okay.
operations, and he had accrued a lot of money. And so he actually owned a car in 1915.
Oh,
And
wow.
that, yeah, and they say that he had so much money that his garage actually had a cement floor.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was
Big time.
yeah. So but when he decides to rob the bank, do the double bank robbery at Stroud, he has a car. He could go in,
Wow.
rob them, and get escape on an automobile. But he knew there are a couple of things. One is that there weren't that many roads, and so escape routes could be blocked for automobiles, right?
Mm,
Um, Tires were made of thin rubber and roads were not great, so there was a high probability of you having a blowout.
right.
Um, so he decided to go back to the old days of like 1893, and he got a chuck wagon and he got filled it with Winchesters and rode into Stroud on horseback. And
Wow.
the whole idea was that after the bank robbery, they would be able to just disappear in the blackjack forest where automobiles couldn't get through, right? It's
Wow.
too
Yeah.
thick. So, he used technology actually against the police,
Yeah. Wow.
he was very cagey in that way.
Wow.
Um, and he transitioned from six shooters to automatics.
Okay.
So yeah, he embraced technology.
So talk to me a little bit about his film, A Debtor to the Law. Um, it's 1919, I think you said.
Yep.
What does this process look like? Who gets involved? How do they even fund these in that time period?
So a Pan American Motion Picture Company out of Muskogee or Tulsa, they approached them and they signed a contract, and then they uh, would there was an advertisement in the paper asking for investors. And
Ah,
so they got enough investors to back it. They there's something called a blue sky commission that they had at the time that oversaw like bad investments, and that Henry Starr was originally supposed to get a big cut of the profits, and they said, well, we can't approve people investing in a criminal, right? A
hmm.
reformed criminal. And so they had to revise the contract, and basically Henry Starr was kind of cut out of a big
Wow.
profit, part of the profit in order for it to go forward, which I think really impacted his decisions later on because, after the film came out, wanted to make a second motion picture. And he just, he was a little desperate for money. He didn't make as much money as he had hoped
Okay.
off that film. So they go into production. They hire a director from Pathé. This was a director who had worked with D.W. Griffith,
Oh
right?
wow.
So he was a legitimate director. He was also an actor at Pathé. Comes in, they shoot the film. They look at the rushes, the dailies, and they go, "Oh boy, these are dark. You know, these are unusable."
Yeah.
And so they say, well, gosh, what are we going to do? And they go, well, there's this other guy who used to be a U.S. Marshal in San Antonio named Patrick P.S. McGeeney, and he has sound stages and
Mm,
he has lights. And so they moved the whole production to San Antonio. And you'll see on one of the lobby cards, they have like a prison movie set that looks nothing like Fort Smith.
right.
But you can see that they actually have real lighting and things like that. And so
Wow.
Patrick S. McGeeney not only comes on as director, but he makes himself the star of the film in a way.
Wow. There you go.
You'll
His
see, you'll see there's some photos, cast photos, and McGeeney is like in the center of the photo. You're like
it
something
was his
odd about
lights, I guess.
yeah, well, it was his lights, it was his
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
So then so the movie comes out, and it was interesting. People that didn't never met Henry Starr kind of didn't like him, because that was what they'd heard. But the
Yeah.
people who knew him loved him. And a good example of this is that P.S. McGeeney um had when they were both 19 years old, P.S. McGeeney was working on the railroad, and he first met Henry Starr when they were 19, when Henry
Wow.
Starr was trying to rob the train
Oh wow.
and had a gun in his belly, right?
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so all these years later, right? It's for almost 40 years later, 30 years later. Um, they're asking P.S. McGeeney to direct this film. And he's like, well, I only know this guy as a bad guy. And Henry Starr sits down with him, explains, the whole deputy marshal system and how corrupt it was, and he became his biggest advocate. And
Wow.
that happened over and over again.
Yeah.
The guy that one of the bank presidents that he had had the gun in the face and visited him later when he was injured, he won him over to his side and actually testified at his trial on his behalf. Same thing with during one of his last bank robberies, one of the guys that he had a gun on later becomes his biggest defender.
Wow. That's
And
so
it was,
unique.
yeah, and it was because he was so intelligent and charming.
Yeah.
He just had an authenticity that really resonated with people, and they just warmed to him.
Wow. And so his film is lost to history, is that correct?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm still hoping that somebody digs through their great grandfather's
Yeah.
closet and finds a film canister and it's saved. Yeah, so it's lost to history. So over the years, I've been trying to gather what I could, and there's some, lobby cards. I have
Right.
the press kit on how it was
Okay.
marketed and the film. And so in the book, I try to recreate what it was like. So it's
Mm.
like you're watching it on the screen.
Wow.
So
Wow.
you could feel like it's, right there,
Yeah.
and you're in the audience.
Wow. Wow. Interesting. And so obviously, like you said, it didn't work out quite as Starr had hoped in hopes of getting more movie deals. What does his path look like after this film comes out?
So he tries to raise financing himself, and he goes to Claremore, city of Claremore, which was
Mm.
at the time, this is the hometown of Will Rogers.
Okay.
At the time, they the biggest economy in Claremore was their radium baths.
Oh, jeez.
If anybody's ever heard of radium baths. A oil man out there was trying to find oil, and instead this sulfurous water bursts from the ground, and so he makes a lemonade out of lemons and decides to pipe it and make them into baths, healing baths, and he thought an exciting name would be radium baths.
Had to be there, I guess.
Yeah. Well, there was no radium, but it sounded exotic. And
Yeah.
so, and so, I mean, they had tons of hotels, and if you pulled into the train station in Claremore, there were people handing out leaflets about how, these baths could solve everything
Wow.
from dandruff to whatever, body aches. And Will Rogers made a joke that it could cure everything but presidential ambition.
Oh,
So he goes to Claremore and he pitches to the Claremore Commercial Club, which was a booster organization. And so he pitches a new motion picture, and he would be an outlaw on the run. So he's not stretching himself too much here,
no.
but it wasn't but it wasn't going to be biographical. So he's like transitioning into actually, being an
Okay.
actor in stories. And he's an outlaw that's injured, and he's on the run, and there's a doctor in town that's an old pal, and gives him these curative radium baths, and it heals him, and he finds the love of a good woman and changes his life, right? So this is the pitch that, the movie will not only promote radium baths, but his reputation will bring in crowds.
Right.
But the commercial club is kind of dragging their feet, and he's just not able to find the money. So, he's a guy that always knew where to find money when he needed
Yeah. At the
it.
bank, I think.
So he decides, even though he's reformed, he's going to rob one last bank.
Wow. And
And I
what
don't want to
year?
give away any more than
No,
that.
and what year was that? That
That
would
was
have been
1921.
okay. So he's only 3 years removed from his prison stint.
Yeah,
Wow,
yeah,
interesting,
yeah.
interesting. And one thing that's so interesting to me too about Henry Starr is, you know, especially like the Old West, where he came from, it was so constantly rewritten, whether it was by Hollywood or dime
Mm-hmm.
novels, or even in Henry's case, the outlaws themselves, rewriting it. Now that you've kind of gone back and you've read his autobiography and done the actual primary source research and put together your book, how do you see myth and reality with Henry Starr's life? Was all of it pretty true? Was what can we take from what his real life was and what we see later in books and dime novels and
Yeah, well, what's interesting, so he published his autobiography in 1913, and he writes this when he gets out of Colorado State Penitentiary,
okay,
and he's fully reformed. And the book ends before some of the biggest events of his life, which
yeah,
is the double bank robbery in Stroud that takes place in 1915,
yeah,
and then him becoming a motion picture star. So
right,
there's so much more that happened after that. Another interesting thing that I discovered is that there was a first draft of the autobiography that never was
interesting,
published. Some of it overlaps. So I'm actually creating an annotated, revised version of his autobiography using some of that old information that I just came across, which was the earlier draft. And
Right.
there's a lot more, he was a lot more forthcoming in some areas in his earlier
Mm,
draft than
interesting.
he was in the one that was published later. I think it's always difficult to separate fact from fiction. You know, the famous quote about, print the fiction.
Yeah.
Um, and he has a different point of view on a lot of the facts. Uh, the bank robbers are notorious liars
Yeah.
generally.
Yeah.
So a lot of times he says he wasn't involved in a bank robbery. Do you believe him or not? I mean, he's still,
Yeah.
on his deathbed, he boasted that he had robbed more banks than any man in America. But there were a
Mm,
lot of them that he denied robbing, especially when he was out and trying to reform and needed
right.
a good life. He was being accused of every bank robbery.
Right.
So it's a little difficult. As it was talked about in the very beginning, there was a lot of sensationalistic journalism that shaped what he was, and how people perceived him. And so his autobiography and the film were trying to set the record straight, but I don't think that we'll ever truly know all of it,
Right.
how much of it was really, really true or not. Um, but I'm sort of obviously I kind of root for Henry Starr. I find him charming, and in his autobiographies he's charming. He's
Yeah.
funny, and he tells great stories. And gosh, I sure would like to have met him.
Yeah. Well, and he's walking this tightrope, especially right before he makes his film of, I want to sensationalize my story, obviously, to
Yeah,
to get
yeah,
interest,
yeah.
in what I'm trying to do, but at the same time, turn another cheek and live a different life. Did you see that reflected at all in his autobiography, in the personal stories later?
Well, there is always that duality of film where the violence has to be exciting, but then you want to also have a moral message behind it.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, there was a big deal when he had unfortunate timing in that his film came out in 1919,
Uh-huh.
and this was the same time that Prohibition
Oh,
started,
yeah.
right? So the Women's Christian Temperance Union had successfully gotten prohibition passed, and they were feeling very full of themselves and successful, and so they had to turn their eyes onto a new prize, a new goal, right?
Uh-oh.
And so,
For Henry, I think.
right. So what they turned to was film censorship.
Okay.
They wanted to control this new medium that was going to corrupt the youth of America.
Yeah.
Well, so this motion picture is announced in 1919, and they're immediately, oh my gosh, we can't make a hero out of an outlaw.
Yeah.
And so they turned all their attention to Henry Starr, pressuring legislators both in Oklahoma at the state level and at the federal level to have film censorship, to ban
Wow.
bandits from being in motion pictures. And then a lot of the legislation actually mentioned Henry Starr specifically. Like,
Wow.
we do not allow Henry Starr to make motion pictures.
Yeah.
And then they put a lot of pressure on theater owners. And there was an organization called the Theater Owners and Managers Association out of Oklahoma. And as I mentioned, the film industry was booming, and they were starting to build movie palaces,
Right.
right? That became a very big, huge, seating capacity. Well, these theater owners certainly didn't either want local censorship or
Right.
federal censorship. They didn't want these old ladies from the WCTU being the ones who decided what movies they could put in
Yeah.
their theater.
Yeah.
So they made a compromise, and they said, we will refuse to show Henry Starr's motion pictures in our theaters if
Wow.
you drop this legislation. So Henry Starr is coming out in 1919 with a film that he can't show anywhere,
Yeah. Wow.
right? And so that was part of what hurt his box office. So he actually hired a teenager to carry the film canister in his little roadster from town to town because you
Wow.
had a lot of independent theaters that
Yeah.
weren't these palaces. So he could go to all the small towns. But what would happen is he would have to screen it for the ministers and the city
Oh,
council.
wow.
And then they would have to go, okay, yeah. And most of them would go, yeah, no, this is a good moral lesson for
Right,
the
right.
youth of our town. And so they would screen the film. So, he was able to make some money, but it could have been much bigger. Now,
Yeah.
even with that, he was told that, if you could make one more motion picture with you as the star, you could punch your ticket to Hollywood and
Wow.
you could change your whole life trajectory. And so that's why he was so desperate to make
Yeah.
a second motion picture.
Do you think that pressure on that first film led to it being lost to history in the
Well,
fact that
part of it, two
okay.
things. One is that um, it wasn't a major motion picture company. It wasn't like it was made by
Hmm.
Universal
Right, right.
or some, it's one of the big companies. So I don't think there were that many prints
Okay.
made. Like I know that it appeared in Dallas and I believe it's in Kansas City, and throughout Oklahoma. I don't know how many prints were
Oh,
originally created, but it wasn't one of those big print runs.
right.
So that might be part of it. And then also could be too that, maybe people just went, oh, we don't like bank robbers, you know.
Yeah. Changing times as he experienced throughout his life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and you're a screenwriter by
Yes.
trade, and is Henry Starr's story one that you plan on adapting for screen, and what might that look like in the future?
Yeah, so this has actually been worked backwards. So I wrote my the screenplay in the 90s,
Oh, okay.
and I've been submitting it to Sundance Institute
Yeah,
and all these different places. So yeah, I've got the screenplay ready. It's an awesome
yeah.
screenplay. I just need the financing,
Mm.
and I'm considering robbing a bank.
It worked for him.
It did, sort of.
Well, yeah. You have to read the book.
Yeah, yeah.
In my final question for you today, Mark, what other projects are you working on? I know you said you're working on an annotated version of his original autobiography. Are there any other projects forthcoming that our listeners might be interested in?
Yeah, so I'm going to have this annotated version, and then I'm going to narrate it as well.
Oh, okay.
And that should be out, hopefully in a month or so.
Great.
I'm also thinking of creating a one-man show based on
Oh,
this work. There was, like Will Rogers USA did a
yeah.
that was that one-man show, and there was a Mark Twain one-man show, and it seems like, as I've been touring Oklahoma and Arkansas, there's just it feels like there's really an audience for this story and
Right.
bringing it to life, and so I'm going to work on a one-man show for this as well.
Wow, interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time today and bringing Henry's story back into the light. I mean, without that, I don't know if we would ever have that true full story from our perspective. And
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I found his autobiography in the bargain bin at Crown Books, and so I'm
yeah.
trying to bring him out of the bargain bin of history.
That's right. Perfect way to say it. Well, the real thrilling events of bank robber Henry Starr is available now, wherever books are sold, and I encourage anyone listening to pick it up and experience this kind of collision of history and outlaws and early cinema in the West. And if you enjoyed this conversation, share the episode, give us a rating, and join us next time on Right in the West. Mark, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, take care.
Bye bye.